The small interrogation room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Across the table, Detective Laura Hughes leaned in, her eyes scanning the face of the boy sitting across from her. 11-year-old Jacob sat stiffly in his chair, his eyes red from hours of crying. His hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the wooden table. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," Jacob stammered, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." Detective Hughes exchanged a quick glance with her partner, Officer Bryant, who stood leaning against the wall, arms folded. The boy's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. They hadn't told him what they knew, hadn't even started their questioning yet. But Jacob was crumbling, his guilt bubbling to the surface. "Jacob," Detective Hughes said softly, "just tell us what happened that night." The boy's chest heaved as he took a deep breath. His eyes darted nervously around the room before finally locking onto hers. "They didn't believe me. Nobody believed me. But it was my fault." "What happened to Mrs. Carter?" The room seemed to freeze. Detective Hughes's pen hovered over her notepad. "What happened to Mrs. Carter?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Jacob whispered, "She's dead because of me." The words hit the room like a sledgehammer, and for a moment, all anyone could hear was the hum of the overhead light. Detective Hughes felt the chill of dread settle over her. Mrs. Carter, one of the most beloved members of their tight-knit community, had disappeared 3 nights ago. And now, sitting before her, this boy was confessing to something she could scarcely imagine. "Start from the beginning, Jacob," she urged. "We need to understand what happened." Jacob's lip quivered. It was that night, the stormy one. The night Jacob referred to had been unrelenting. Rain poured in thick sheets, and thunder roared like the sky itself was angry. Jacob sat by his bedroom window, staring out at the drenched streets of their quiet suburban neighborhood. His mom, a nurse, had left for a night shift at the hospital. It was just Jacob and his older brother, Nathan, at home. Nathan, who was 16 and perpetually glued to his phone, had been tasked with babysitting Jacob. But as usual, Nathan ignored him, leaving Jacob to entertain himself. Jacob wasn't upset, though. He was used to it. He liked being on his own. It gave him time to work on his favorite pastime, building tiny replicas of their neighborhood with cardboard and glue. As the storm raged on, Jacob carefully placed a miniature tree beside a cardboard house when he heard it. A loud knock on the front door. His hands froze. It was almost midnight. Who would visit them in this weather? He glanced at Nathan, who didn't budge from the couch, his face illuminated by his phone screen. "Nathan," Jacob said, "someone's at the door." Nathan groaned. "Don't answer it." "But I said don't." Nathan snapped, his tone sharp. Jacob hesitated. Something about the knock unsettled him. It wasn't the polite tapping of a neighbor. It was frantic and uneven, like someone was desperate. Ignoring his brother's order, Jacob tiptoed to the window beside the door and peeked out. He saw Mrs. Carter standing on their porch, soaked to the bone, her eyes wide with fear. Jacob flung the door open before she could knock again. "Mrs. Carter?" he said, surprised. "What are you doing out here?" Her hands gripped his shoulders, her fingers ice cold. "Jacob," she said in a shaky voice, "I need your help. Please, I don't have much time." Jacob didn't understand what she meant. "What's wrong?" he asked. Nathan appeared behind him, scowling. "Who is it?" he muttered. But his expression changed when he saw Mrs. Carter. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Carter ignored him, her attention fixed on Jacob. "You have to come with me," she pleaded. "Right now. It's important." Jacob hesitated. He'd known Mrs. Carter for years. She was the sweet older woman who baked cookies for the kids on their block every holiday season. But she didn't seem like herself tonight. Her eyes darted around as if she expected something, or someone, to appear out of the darkness. Nathan folded his arms. "He's not going anywhere," he said firmly. "What's your problem, anyway?" "I can't explain it here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, Jacob, you have to trust me." Before Jacob could respond, the streetlights outside flickered, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. He could barely make out Mrs. Carter's face in the shadows, but her panicked breathing told him she was terrified. Jacob turned to Nathan. "Maybe we should call Mom." Nathan rolled his eyes. And tell her what? That Mrs. Carter's acting weird? She's just old and confused. Go back inside. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong. Mrs. Carter, he said cautiously, where do you want me to go? Nathan grabbed his arm. You're not going anywhere, he said angrily. Jacob pulled free. Nathan, stop. She needs help. Mrs. Carter didn't wait for their argument to end. She grabbed Jacob's hand and began pulling him toward the street. Hurry, she said, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. We don't have much time. Jacob, Nathan yelled after him. Get back here. I'm telling Mom. But Jacob didn't stop. He followed Mrs. Carter down the street, his heart pounding. She led him to her car, parked haphazardly at the curb. The driver's side door was open, and the interior light revealed papers scattered across the seats. Get in, she urged. Jacob hesitated. Where are we going? Somewhere safe, she said, but her tone was far from reassuring. Before he could respond, a car engine roared to life down the block. Jacob turned to see headlights cutting through the rain, speeding toward them. Get in now, Mrs. Carter shouted. The urgency in her voice pushed Jacob over the edge. He climbed into the passenger seat just as Mrs. Carter jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The mysterious car behind them skidded to a stop as Mrs. Carter floored the gas pedal. Jacob clutched his seatbelt as the tires screeched and the car shot forward. He glanced at Mrs. Carter, her face pale and determined. Mrs. Carter, he stammered. What's going on? Who are those people? She didn't answer. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The car behind them gave chase, its headlights glowing menacingly in the rearview mirror. Jacob's heart raced as questions swirled in his mind. What had Mrs. Carter gotten them into? Who was following them? And why did she choose him, of all people, to help her? Just as he opened his mouth to ask again, the car jerked violently to the side, throwing Jacob against the door. Mrs. Carter had swerved to avoid something in the road. The tires lost traction, and the car spun out of control. Jacob's scream was drowned out by the deafening crash of metal against metal. In the interrogation room, Jacob's voice faltered as he reached this part of his story. Tears streamed down his face, and he buried his head in his hands. Detective Hughes leaned forward. What happened after the crash, Jacob? Tell us. Jacob raised his head slowly, his face a mask of guilt and fear. I saw her, he whispered. I saw Mrs. Carter lying there, and I thought she was dead. His voice cracked. But then she whispered something to me. She told me. Detective Hughes held her breath, waiting for him to finish. Jacob's next words sent chills down her spine. She told me to run. Detective Hughes froze. The words hung heavy in the air, thick with implications. Across the table, Jacob's trembling hands gripped the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. His voice was barely above a whisper as he repeated, She told me to run. Run from what, Jacob? Hughes pressed, her voice calm but insistent. What were you running from? Jacob shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I don't know. I didn't understand at first, but then I saw them. Who did you see? Hughes asked, leaning in closer. The people in the car, Jacob choked out. They got out, and they were coming toward us. Detective Hughes exchanged a glance with Officer Bryant, whose jaw tightened as he pushed off the wall and stepped closer to the table. Take your time, Jacob, Hughes said. We're here to help you. Jacob wiped his face with his sleeve, sniffling as he tried to compose himself. I didn't know what to do. Mrs. Carter wasn't moving anymore, and the car was smashed. I was so scared. What did you do next? Hughes asked gently. Jacob hesitated, his small shoulders trembling. I ran, he admitted. I ran as fast as I could. I didn't even look back. 3 nights earlier, Jacob had stumbled through the pouring rain, his sneakers slipping on the slick pavement. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. Behind him, the faint sound of footsteps splashing through puddles sent a surge of panic through his chest. He didn't dare turn around. He ducked into an alley between 2 houses, pressing his back against the cold, wet brick wall. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he tried to stay quiet. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Jacob peeked around the corner, his heart pounding in his ears. Two shadowy figures stood near the wrecked car, their faces obscured by the rain and darkness. One of them shone a flashlight through the shattered windshield, illuminating Mrs. Carter's motionless form. The other scanned the street, as if searching for something or someone. Jacob pressed himself against the wall, his stomach churning. He didn't understand what was happening, but every instinct told him these people were dangerous. He clutched the locket hanging around his neck, a gift from his late father, and whispered a silent prayer. The sound of a car door slamming made him flinch. He risked another glance around the corner and saw the two figures getting into their car. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off into the night. Jacob didn't move for what felt like an eternity, his legs trembling from exhaustion and fear. When he finally stepped out of the alley, the rain had begun to let up. The streets were eerily quiet, and the wrecked car stood alone under the flickering streetlight. Mrs. Carter was still inside. In the interrogation room, Jacob's voice grew quieter as he recounted the events. "I thought about going back to check on her," he said, his eyes staring at the table. "But I was too scared. What if they came back?" Detective Hughes nodded slowly, her pen scratching across her notepad. "You said you saw the people in the car. Did you recognize them?" Jacob hesitated, his face twisting with uncertainty. "No," he admitted. "They were wearing dark clothes, and it was raining so hard I couldn't see their faces. Did they say anything?" Brian asked, his voice deep and steady. Jacob shook his head. "Not that I could hear. But they were looking for me." "I know they were. Why do you think that?" Hughes pressed. "Because," Jacob's voice wavered. "Because Mrs. Carter told me they would. Before we left the house, she said they'd stop at nothing to find her. And anyone with her." The room fell silent, the weight of Jacob's words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Detective Hughes leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If what Jacob was saying was true, then this wasn't just an accident. It was something far more sinister. "What happened after the car left?" she asked. Jacob's gaze dropped to his lap. "I ran home," he said quietly. "I didn't tell Nathan. I didn't tell anyone. I just went to my room and pretended none of it happened." Bryant frowned. "You mean you left Mrs. Carter there, alone?" Jacob flinched, guilt flashing across his face. "I didn't know what else to do," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was scared." Detective Hughes exhaled slowly, her pen tapping against her notepad. "Jacob," she said gently, "I know you're scared, but you did the right thing by coming here. We need you to be as honest as possible so we can figure out what happened." Jacob nodded, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "There's more," he said. "Something I didn't tell you." Hughes leaned forward. "What is it?" Jacob's eyes darted nervously around the room, as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. "When I was hiding in the alley," he said, "I heard them say something. One of them said, 'Find the boy. He's the key.'" Hughes's stomach dropped. "The key to what?" she asked. "I don't know," Jacob said, his voice trembling. "But whatever it is, I think Mrs. Carter knew." The rain had finally stopped by the time Jacob reached his house that night. His clothes were soaked, and his lungs burned from running. He slipped inside quietly, careful not to wake Nathan, who had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV still on. Jacob went straight to his room, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Carter's last words to him. Run? Why had she brought him into this? What did she know that made those people so desperate to find her and him? Jacob sat on his bed, clutching the locket around his neck. It had been his father's, a simple silver pendant engraved with the word hope. His dad used to tell him it would protect him, no matter what. But tonight, Jacob felt anything but safe. As he lay down, exhaustion finally taking over, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, those people were still looking for him, and Jacob had no idea why. The sound of Detective Hughes's pen clicking brought Jacob back to the present. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "Jacob," she said, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about Mrs. Carter. Anything she said or did that seemed unusual." Jacob hesitated, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table. "There was one thing," he said slowly. Something she said right before we left my house. Hughes waited, her pen poised over her notepad. She said, Jacob swallowed hard. She said, they're coming. And if they get what they're after, it's all over. Detective Hughes's pen froze midair. Jacob's words echoed in her mind. If they get what they're after, it's all over. She leaned forward, her voice steady but urgent. Did she say what they were after, Jacob? Did she explain? Jacob shook his head, his hands gripping the edge of the table. No, he whispered. She just kept saying we had to leave before they found her. Hughes exchanged a tense glance with Officer Bryant, who nodded subtly. They were piecing together a story that was growing darker with every word. Jacob, Hughes said carefully, this is very important. Did Mrs. Carter have anything with her? A bag, a box, anything unusual? Jacob furrowed his brow, trying to remember. She had a bag, he said slowly. It was small, like a purse, but she was holding it so tight, like she didn't want to let it go. Do you remember what was in it? Jacob hesitated. She never opened it in front of me, but I think it was heavy. She kept holding it close to her chest, even when we were in the car. Detective Hughes's mind raced. Whatever Mrs. Carter had in that bag was likely the key to this entire mystery. And if those people were willing to chase her down in the middle of a storm, it must have been something valuable or dangerous. Jacob, Hughes said, her tone firm but kind. You're doing really well, but I need you to think hard. Did Mrs. Carter say anything else about why they were after her? Or why she came to you? Jacob looked down at the table, his small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the surface. She said, his voice trembled. She said I reminded her of someone who could help her. Who? Bryant asked, his deep voice cutting through the room. I don't know, Jacob admitted, his voice barely audible. She just said I reminded her of him, and that I was the only one who could help her now. 3 nights earlier, Jacob had sat in Mrs. Carter's car, his hands gripping the seatbelt as the rain lashed against the windows. The wreck that would change everything hadn't happened yet. At that moment, he was still trying to make sense of her frantic words. Mrs. Carter, Jacob said cautiously, why did you come to me? Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel. Because I didn't have a choice, she replied, her voice taut with fear. I couldn't trust anyone else. Jacob frowned. Not even the police? No, she said quickly. Not the police. Not anyone. You're the only one, Jacob. The boy didn't understand. How could he, an 11-year-old, be the only one to help her? He glanced at the bag on her lap, which she clutched as though her life depended on it. What's in the bag? He asked hesitantly. Mrs. Carter's eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then she said, something that could change everything. Jacob's confusion only grew. Change what? Before she could respond, the headlights of another car appeared in the rearview mirror. Mrs. Carter's entire demeanor shifted. Her hands tightened on the wheel, and her breathing quickened. They found us, she whispered. In the interrogation room, Jacob's voice wavered as he recounted the memory. I think that's why she told me to run, he said. She knew they were after the bag. Detective Hughes nodded slowly, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Mrs. Carter's disappearance anymore. It was about whatever she had been carrying, and the people who were willing to do anything to get it. Jacob, Hughes said gently, you've been very brave to tell us all this. But there's one more thing we need to know. After the crash, did you see what happened to the bag? Jacob shook his head, his expression filled with guilt. I didn't think about it, he admitted. I just ran. Hughes leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still so many unanswered questions. What was in the bag? Why had Mrs. Carter chosen Jacob? And who were the people chasing them? 3 nights earlier, the rain had been relentless as Mrs. Carter's car hurtled down the slick streets. The headlights of the pursuing vehicle grew brighter, closing the distance between them. Jacob clutched the armrest, his heart pounding. Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice shaking. What are we going to do? We're going to lose them, she replied, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Hold on. She took a sharp turn, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. The pursuing car followed, its engine roaring. Jacob glanced out the rear window, his stomach twisting with fear. The other car wasn't giving up. Mrs. Carter's grip on the wheel was steady, but Jacob could see the tension in her face. She pressed harder on the gas, the engine straining as they sped through the empty streets. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road, illuminated by the car's headlights. Mrs. Carter gasped and swerved, trying to avoid them. The tires screamed as the car spun out of control, crashing into a lamppost with a sickening crunch. Jacob's head slammed against the window, the world spinning around him. When the car finally came to a stop, everything was silent except for the sound of rain pattering against the shattered windshield. "Mrs. Carter?" Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. He turned to her and saw her slumped over the wheel, motionless. Before he could process what had happened, the sound of car doors slamming sent a jolt of fear through him. He looked up and saw two shadowy figures approaching the wrecked car, their faces obscured by the rain. Jacob's instincts took over. He unbuckled his seatbelt and scrambled out of the car, his heart pounding. As he ran, he heard one of the figures shout, "Find the bag." Back in the interrogation room, Jacob's voice faltered as he reached the end of his story. Detective Hughes leaned forward, her expression serious. "Jacob," she said, "do you think those people knew who you were?" Jacob hesitated, his small hands trembling. "I don't know," he said, "but I think Mrs. Carter did." "What makes you say that?" Hughes asked. Jacob's eyes filled with tears. "Because before the crash, he whispered, 'She told me something.' She said, 'You're the only one who can finish what he started.'" Detective Hughes's pulse quickened as she processed Jacob's words. "You're the only one who can finish what he started." The weight of the statement hung heavily in the room. It wasn't just a cryptic remark. It was a thread connecting Jacob, Mrs. Carter, and whatever dangerous secret she had been carrying. "What do you think she meant by that, Jacob?" Hughes asked, her voice steady despite the storm of questions racing through her mind. Jacob's face scrunched in confusion. "I don't know. I didn't even have time to ask her." Detective Hughes exchanged a look with Officer Bryant, whose expression mirrored her own unease. Whoever he was, whatever had been started, it was clear that Jacob was now caught in something far bigger than he could understand. "Jacob," Hughes said carefully, "we need to go back to that moment. When Mrs. Carter said those words, did she mention anyone's name?" Jacob shook his head. "No," he whispered. "She just looked at me, like I was supposed to understand." 3 nights earlier, after the crash, Jacob had stumbled through the rain, his heart hammering in his chest. He darted between houses, desperately searching for a place to hide. The sound of the figures yelling behind him sent fresh waves of terror through his small frame. "Check the car," one of them barked. "The bag has to be there." Jacob pressed himself against the side of a garage, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His clothes clung to his skin, soaked from the downpour, and his mind raced with 1,000 unanswered questions. Why had Mrs. Carter said he was the only one who could help? What was in the bag? And who were these people? He peered around the corner and saw the two figures rummaging through the wrecked car. One of them pulled open the driver's side door and reached for Mrs. Carter, who was still slumped over the wheel. Jacob's stomach twisted. He wanted to run back, to help her. But what could he do? He was just a kid. "Nothing here." One of the figures growled, slamming the door shut. "Spread out. The boy might have it." Jacob's heart dropped. They were looking for him now. The figure with the flashlight scanned the surrounding area, the beam cutting through the rain like a knife. Jacob ducked behind a trash can, his small body trembling. He clenched his father's locket in his hand, whispering a silent plea for strength. When the footsteps grew closer, Jacob bit his lip to stifle a whimper. The beam of light swept past the trash can, and for a brief moment, Jacob thought he'd been spotted. But then the figure turned and moved in the opposite direction, disappearing into the shadows. Jacob didn't wait. As soon as the coast was clear, he bolted, his sneakers splashing through puddles. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get as far away as possible. In the present, Jacob sat in the interrogation room, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table. Detective Hughes tapped her pen against her notepad, deep in thought. "Jacob," she said, Do you think Mrs. Carter might have hidden the bag before the crash? Jacob hesitated. Maybe, he said quietly. She kept looking at it, like she was thinking about something. But I don't know what she did with it after. Hughes nodded, her mind racing. If Mrs. Carter had hidden the bag, there was a chance it was still out there. And if the people chasing her hadn't found it yet, that meant time was running out before they tried again. Jacob, Hughes said gently, this is very important. Did Mrs. Carter say anything else before the crash? Anything at all that might help us understand why she came to you? Jacob's gaze dropped to his lap. She said. His voice trailed off, and he shook his head. It doesn't make sense. What doesn't make sense? Hughes pressed. She said I was brave, like my dad, Jacob whispered. But my dad died when I was little. I don't even remember him. The room fell silent. Detective Hughes exchanged a glance with Bryant, who raised an eyebrow. This was the first time Jacob had mentioned his father, and it felt like a piece of the puzzle they hadn't yet considered. What was your dad's name, Jacob? Hughes asked gently. David, Jacob said. David Parker. Hughes froze. The name rang a bell, though she couldn't immediately place it. She scribbled a note in her pad, making a mental reminder to dig into David Parker's background. 3 nights earlier, Jacob had finally made it back to his house, drenched and shivering. He slipped inside quietly, careful not to wake Nathan, who was still snoring on the couch. Jacob's heart was racing, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He went straight to his room and locked the door, his body trembling from the cold. Pulling the locket from around his neck, he opened it, revealing the tiny photo inside. A picture of his father holding him as a baby. Jacob stared at it, his tears mixing with the rainwater still dripping from his hair. Dad, he whispered, clutching the locket tightly. I don't know what to do. He sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of the night pressing down on him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mrs. Carter's terrified face, heard her desperate words. You're the only one who can finish what he started. But what had his dad started? And why did it matter now? Years after his death, Jacob didn't have any answers. All he knew was that Mrs. Carter had trusted him with something important, and now she was gone. Detective Hughes leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She could see the toll the night had taken on Jacob, the exhaustion etched into his young face. But she also saw something else, a quiet strength beneath the fear. Jacob, she said gently, you've been through so much already. I promise we're going to do everything we can to keep you safe. Jacob looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Do you think they'll come after me again? Hughes hesitated, then said, we're going to make sure they don't. But we need your help to figure out who they are and what they want. Jacob nodded slowly. I'll try, he said. But there's one more thing I didn't tell you. Hughes leaned forward, her pen ready. What is it? Jacob hesitated, his hands trembling. Before I ran, when I was hiding, I heard one of them say something. They said, we have to find it before the others do. Hughes's stomach tightened. The others? Jacob nodded. Yeah, I don't know who they meant, but it sounded like there's more of them. Detective Hughes's breath caught. There's more of them. The statement opened up a whole new level of danger. It wasn't just 2 individuals chasing Mrs. Carter and Jacob. It was likely part of something much larger. Something orchestrated. Something calculated. She exchanged a look with Officer Bryant, who gave her a sharp nod, understanding the gravity of what they were dealing with. Bryant stepped out of the room briefly, likely to make a call or relay instructions. Hughes turned back to Jacob, whose trembling hands fidgeted on the table. Jacob, she began gently, you've been incredibly brave, but I need you to think carefully. Did anything about those people stand out? Their voices, the way they looked, or what they wore? Jacob's brow furrowed as he tried to remember. They were wearing dark clothes, like jackets or coats, he said. One of them was tall, taller than most people I know. The other was shorter, but they were strong. I could hear it in their voice. It was deep and kind of rough. Hughes scribbled notes, piecing together the picture. Did they say anything else besides looking for the bag and mentioning the others? Jacob hesitated, biting his lip. The tall one. He said something about it being their last chance. Like they couldn't fail. Hughes's pin paused. Did he say why? Jacob shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. No, but he sounded really serious. Like, if they didn't find it, something bad would happen. 3 nights earlier, Jacob lay in his bed, shivering beneath the covers. His wet clothes lay in a heap on the floor, and his mind replayed the events of the night on a loop. The crash, the shadowy figures, the cryptic things Mrs. Carter had said. It all felt like a dream he couldn't wake up from. He clutched his father's locket tightly, as if it could somehow protect him. The photo inside was slightly worn, but Jacob knew every detail by heart. His dad's warm smile, the soft curl of his hair, the way he held baby Jacob like he was the most important thing in the world. Jacob stared at the locket, his father's words echoing in his mind. His dad used to say, "Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right, even when you are." That thought gave Jacob a little strength, but it didn't answer the one question that burned in his mind. What did my dad have to do with this? A sudden sound jolted Jacob out of his thoughts. It was faint at first, like a soft tap on glass. He froze, his heart pounding. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from his bedroom window. Jacob sat up slowly, his breath hitching in his throat. Rain still trickled against the glass, but this sound was deliberate. Someone, or something, was outside. He slid out of bed, his bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. The tapping grew louder as he approached the window, his small frame trembling with fear. Carefully, he peeked through the curtain. What he saw made his blood run cold. A figure stood outside, barely visible in the dim light. They were dressed in black, their face obscured by a hood. The figure raised a hand and tapped on the glass again, the sound sharp and deliberate. Jacob stumbled back, his heart racing. He wanted to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, standing eerily still in the shadows. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Jacob turned and bolted for the door. He flung it open and raced down the hallway, his feet pounding against the floor. "Nathan!" he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Nathan, wake up!" Nathan groaned from the couch, pulling a pillow over his head. "What now, Jacob?" he mumbled, his voice groggy with sleep. "There's someone outside my window," Jacob shouted, shaking his brother's shoulder. Nathan sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "Someone's there," Jacob insisted, pointing toward his room. They were tapping on the glass. "I saw them," Nathan sighed, clearly annoyed. But he stood up and followed Jacob back to the bedroom. When they reached the window, Nathan pulled back the curtain and froze. The figure was still there, standing motionless in the rain. Even Nathan, usually so dismissive of Jacob's worries, looked uneasy. "What the?" he muttered, his voice trailing off. Before Jacob could say anything, the figure raised their hand again and pointed directly at him. It wasn't a threatening gesture, it was deliberate, almost as if they were trying to communicate something. Nathan grabbed Jacob's arm and pulled him back. "We're calling the cops," he said firmly, his voice low. "Stay here." "No," Jacob protested. "What if they leave before the cops come? We have to figure out who they are." "Are you crazy?" Nathan snapped. "We're not going near them." But Jacob couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his chest. Something about the figure's gesture reminded him of Mrs. Carter. Something desperate, something urgent. Back in the interrogation room, Jacob's voice shook as he recounted the encounter. "They didn't try to break in or anything," he said. "They just stood there, like they were waiting for me." Detective Hughes tapped her pen against the notepad, her mind racing. This new development complicated everything. Whoever had been outside Jacob's window wasn't just chasing after Mrs. Carter's bag. They were directly targeting Jacob now. "Did they say anything?" Hughes asked. "No," Jacob replied, shaking his head. "But they kept pointing at me, like they wanted me to come outside." "And then what happened?" Hughes pressed. Jacob swallowed hard. "Nathan called the cops. But by the time they showed up, the person was gone." Hughes nodded, scribbling down notes. "Do you think it was one of the same people who were chasing you and Mrs. Carter?" "I don't know," Jacob admitted. "It could have been. But it didn't feel the same." What do you mean? Jacob hesitated, searching for the right words. The people chasing us were scary. But this person, they didn't feel like they wanted to hurt me. It was like they wanted to tell me something. As Detective Hughes listened, a chilling thought crossed her mind. If the figure outside Jacob's window wasn't part of the group chasing Mrs. Carter, then who were they? And more importantly, what did they want with Jacob? Before she could ask another question, the door to the interrogation room opened, and Officer Bryant stepped in, his expression grim. He leaned down and whispered something in Hughes's ear that made her face go pale. "We've got a problem," Bryant said quietly. "Mrs. Carter's car, the bag isn't there. And there's no sign of her body." Detective Hughes froze. Bryant's words struck like a bolt of lightning. The bag isn't there. And there's no sign of her body. She straightened in her chair, her gaze darting back to Jacob, who was staring at them with wide, frightened eyes. His lips trembled as he asked, "What do you mean? Where's Mrs. Carter?" Hughes forced a calm expression, but her mind was spinning. "Jacob," she said, "we don't know yet, but we're working to find out. What's important is that you stay safe." Bryant's face was stone cold as he stepped back toward the door. "I'll update the search team," he muttered before leaving. Hughes turned her attention back to Jacob. "Let's focus on what we know. You've told us so much already. Is there anything else about that night you remember? Anything that seemed out of place?" Jacob shook his head. "I already told you everything." His voice cracked. "I don't know where she is. I thought she—" He stopped, his small frame trembling. "I thought she was dead." The uncertainty in his voice was haunting. If Mrs. Carter's body wasn't in the car, then what had happened after Jacob ran? Had someone taken her? Or was she alive and still in danger? 3 nights earlier, after Nathan had called the police, Jacob sat on the couch, his knees pulled to his chest. He couldn't stop shaking. The figure outside his window was gone, but their presence lingered like a shadow in the room. Nathan sat next to him, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. "The cops will be here soon," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Just stay put." Jacob nodded, but his mind was racing. He kept replaying the way the figure had pointed at him, the urgency in their gesture. What had they wanted? Was it a warning or a summons? Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed outside, and 2 officers knocked on the door. Nathan let them in, explaining what had happened, while Jacob stayed silent, his heart pounding. "Did they say anything?" one of the officers asked. "No," Nathan replied. "They just stood there." It was creepy. The officers exchanged a glance before one of them turned to Jacob. "Did you recognize the person?" Jacob shook his head. "No," he whispered. The officer crouched to Jacob's level, his tone soft. "It's okay, kid. You're safe now. We're going to check the area, see if we can find anything." Jacob wanted to believe him, but a part of him knew that the figure was long gone. Whoever they were, they hadn't come to harm him. They had come to deliver a message. But what that message was, Jacob couldn't say. Back in the interrogation room, Detective Hughes pressed her fingers to her temple, trying to make sense of the tangled web unfolding before her. The absence of Mrs. Carter's body and the missing bag raised more questions than answers. "Jacob," she said carefully, "do you remember anything unusual about Mrs. Carter's car? Was there anything she might have hidden before the crash?" Jacob thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "She kept the bag on her lap the whole time," he said. "But before we left my house, she looked at something in the glove compartment. I don't know what it was." Hughes jotted this down. "Do you think it could have been related to the bag?" "Maybe," Jacob said. "She seemed nervous when she opened it. This small detail could be critical. If Mrs. Carter had stashed something in the glove compartment or anywhere in the car, it might still be there." But the search team had reported finding nothing. Was it possible someone had already retrieved it? Before Hughes could ask more, the door to the interrogation room swung open. Bryant returned, his face grim. "We've got another development," he said. Hughes's stomach tightened. "What now?" Bryant glanced at Jacob, then motioned for Hughes to step outside. "You'll want to hear this," he said. In the hallway, Bryant handed Hughes a folder containing a series of grainy photos. "These are from a traffic camera near the crash site," he explained. Hughes flipped through the images, her eyes narrowing as she studied them. The photos showed Mrs. Carter's car speeding down the rain-soaked street, followed closely by the pursuing vehicle. But one photo stood out, a frame taken just moments before the crash. "What the?" Hughes murmured. The image showed a third car pulling onto the street behind the first two. Its headlights were off, and it hung back at a suspicious distance. There was no record of this vehicle in the initial reports. "We think this might be the others Jacob mentioned," Bryant said. "Whoever they are, they didn't stick around after the crash." Hughes's pulse quickened. If this third car was involved, it could mean the situation was even more dangerous than they'd realized. "Did we get a plate number?" she asked. Bryant shook his head. "Too blurry to make out. But there's one more thing." He handed her another photo, taken just after the crash. Hughes's breath hitched. The image showed the shadowy figures approaching Mrs. Carter's wrecked car. But they weren't alone. A third figure, wearing a hooded jacket, was standing nearby, partially obscured by the rain. "Is that?" Hughes started. "We don't know," Bryant said. "But it matches the description Jacob gave of the person outside his window." Hughes stared at the photo, her mind reeling. If this hooded figure was the same one who had come to Jacob's house, it meant they weren't just an innocent bystander. They were directly connected to whatever was happening, and they had sought out Jacob for a reason. "We need to find this person," Hughes said firmly. "If they were at the crash site, they might know what happened to Mrs. Carter." Bryant nodded. "I'll put out a bulletin. But if they're connected to the others, they'll be hard to track." Hughes clenched her jaw. "We don't have a choice. This is bigger than we thought." Back in the interrogation room, Jacob sat quietly, his fingers tracing the edges of his father's locket. When Hughes re-entered the room, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Did you find her?" he asked softly. Hughes knelt beside him, her tone gentle but firm. "Not yet, Jacob. But we're getting closer. I promise, we're doing everything we can." Jacob nodded, clutching the locket tighter. "I just want her to be okay," he whispered. "She didn't deserve this." Hughes's chest tightened. Jacob's words were a reminder of what was at stake. Not just solving a mystery, but protecting an innocent boy who had been thrust into a nightmare. "Jacob," she said, "I need you to stay strong. We're going to figure this out. But I need you to trust me. Okay?" Jacob hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Okay." As Hughes stood, her mind raced with questions. Who was the hooded figure? What was in Mrs. Carter's bag? And why had she entrusted Jacob with a secret that could cost lives? She didn't have the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't act fast, whatever was coming next would be far worse. The small police station buzzed with activity as Detective Hughes pored over the photos from the crash site. Each image told a story, fragments of a larger puzzle she was determined to solve. The hooded figure loomed large in her mind. Who were they? Why had they come to Jacob's house? And most chillingly, what did they want with him? Officer Bryant entered the room, holding a fresh stack of reports. "We've got a preliminary timeline," he said, placing the papers on the desk. The third car showed up 5 minutes before the crash, stayed on the scene for less than 2 minutes, then disappeared heading north. "Any traffic cams catch where it went after that?" Hughes asked without looking up, her focus on the photos. Bryant shook his head. "The storm knocked out several cameras in that area. They knew what they were doing." Hughes frowned, tapping her pen against the desk. "What about witnesses? Anyone see the crash or the third car?" Bryant hesitated, his expression darkening. "One report just came in. A man walking his dog nearby said he saw someone leaving the scene on foot, heading into the woods." Hughes's head snapped up. On foot? Was it the hooded figure? "Matches Jacob's description," Bryant said. But the witness couldn't get a clear look, said it was too dark, and they stayed off the main road. Hughes pushed back her chair and stood. "Get a team out there. If they went into the woods, they might have left a trail." Bryant nodded and left the room, leaving Hughes alone with her thoughts. She glanced at the interrogation room where Jacob sat, his small figure slumped in the chair. Despite everything, he had been remarkably brave. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he was in more danger than anyone realized. 3 nights earlier, Jacob sat on the couch, his knees tucked to his chest as the police officers combed the yard outside. Nathan had gone to bed, leaving Jacob alone with his thoughts. He stared at his father's locket, running his thumb over the engraved word hope. It felt like the only thing tethering him to reality. The sound of footsteps made him jump. He looked up to see one of the officers, a tall man with a kind face, standing in the doorway. "Hey, Jacob," the officer said softly. "Mind if I sit?" Jacob shook his head, and the officer lowered himself onto the couch. "I'm Officer Green," he said, offering a small smile. "I just wanted to check in on you. I know it's been a scary night." Jacob nodded but didn't say anything. He clutched the locket tightly, its cool metal grounding him. Green noticed the locket and tilted his head. "That's a nice piece. Belong to someone special?" Jacob hesitated before nodding. "My dad," he said quietly. "He gave it to me before he died." "I'm sorry to hear that," Green said, his voice kind. "He must have been a good man." Jacob nodded again. "He said it would protect me," he murmured. Green smiled faintly. "Sounds like he knew you were someone worth protecting." The words brought a lump to Jacob's throat. He glanced out the window, where the rain had finally stopped, and whispered, "Why would someone come to my house? What do they want from me?" Green's expression grew serious. "I don't know, Jacob, but I promise we're going to find out. You're not alone in this." Jacob looked at him, his eyes filled with questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. Instead, he simply said, "I'm scared." Green placed a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. "It's okay to be scared, but you're stronger than you think, and we're here to help." In the present, Detective Hughes flipped through the witness report again, her mind racing. If the hooded figure had fled into the woods, it meant they were either trying to escape or regroup. Either way, they had information the police desperately needed. Her thoughts were interrupted by her phone buzzing on the desk. She picked it up and answered, her tone brisk. "Hughes." "It's Bryant," came the reply. "The team found something in the woods." Hughes's heart leapt. "What is it?" "There's a trail leading to an old cabin about a mile from the crash site," Bryant said. "Looks like someone's been staying there recently. Did they find anyone?" "Not yet," Bryant said, "but they found something you'll want to see." 30 minutes later, Hughes stood outside the cabin, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The structure was small and weathered, its wooden boards warped from years of exposure. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Bryant met her at the door, holding up a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a crumpled piece of paper. "What is it?" Hughes asked, taking the bag and examining the paper. The edges were torn, and the writing was smudged, but a few words were still legible. "Jacob Parker, key. David Parker, legacy." Hughes's breath caught. Jacob's name was on the paper. So was his father's. She looked up at Bryant, her expression grim. "This isn't random," she said. "Whoever's behind this, they've been watching Jacob for a long time." Bryant nodded. "And they're not going to stop until they get what they're after." Hughes's grip on the evidence bag tightened. She glanced at the cabin, her flashlight illuminating the cracked windows and broken doorframe. The place was abandoned, but it was clear someone had been there recently. The question was, were they still nearby? "Search the perimeter," Hughes ordered. "If they're here, I want them found." Bryant nodded and motioned to the search team, who fanned out into the woods. Hughes stepped into the cabin, her flashlight casting long shadows across the empty room. The space was sparse, with only a few pieces of old furniture and a pile of discarded blankets in the corner. On the floor near the blankets was another piece of paper, folded neatly. Hughes crouched and picked it up, her pulse quickening as she unfolded it. The handwriting was the same, but the message was chilling. "Protect the boy. They will come for him next." Hughes's stomach dropped. Whoever had written this wasn't just warning them. They were issuing a dire prediction. And if the hooded figure was right, Jacob was still in grave danger. Back at the station, Hughes returned to the interrogation room, where Jacob sat waiting. She placed a hand on the back of the chair across from him, her expression serious. "Jacob," she said gently, "I need to ask you something important. Did your dad ever talk about anything he was working on? Something he thought was valuable or dangerous?" Jacob looked confused. "No," he said. "He was just a regular guy. He worked at an office." Hughes frowned. "Do you know what kind of work he did?" Jacob shook his head. Not really. He said it was boring stuff. Numbers and paperwork. Hughes nodded, filing this information away. She didn't believe for a second that David Parker's work had been ordinary. Not if it had anything to do with the danger Jacob was now facing. Okay, she said, her voice calm. You've been really brave, Jacob. We're going to keep you safe. But I need you to stay close to us for now. Can you do that? Jacob nodded, his small hand clutching the locket around his neck. Okay, he said softly, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Hughes stepped out of the room and closed the door, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Whoever was after Jacob wasn't just chasing a bag, they were chasing a legacy. And if the message from the cabin was true, Jacob's life was hanging by a thread. The police station hummed with quiet tension. Detective Hughes leaned against her desk, staring at the cryptic notes recovered from the cabin. The phrases swirled in her mind. Jacob Parker, David Parker, legacy, protect the boy. The connections were tenuous, but one thing was clear. Jacob's father, David Parker, had been involved in something far from ordinary. And whatever it was, it had placed Jacob in imminent danger. Officer Bryant returned, his face grim. Perimeter search came up empty. Whoever was at that cabin is long gone. Hughes exhaled slowly. Figures. But they left those notes for a reason. They want us to know Jacob is in danger. Bryant crossed his arms. The question is, why? What's so special about this kid and his dad? That's what we're going to find out, Hughes said. Pull everything we have on David Parker. Employment records, financials, anything. There has to be a reason he's tied to this. Bryant nodded. Already on it. 3 nights earlier, Jacob had barely slept. The figure outside his window haunted his thoughts, but it was the words Mrs. Carter had said that weighed on him the most. You're the only one who can finish what he started. What had his dad started? And why had Mrs. Carter trusted him to finish it? The rain had finally stopped by the time the police left. Nathan had fallen asleep again on the couch, but Jacob sat by the window, staring out at the empty street. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe the figure, or maybe answers. But the silence was deafening. A sudden flash of movement caught his eye. Jacob's heart skipped a beat as he pressed his face to the glass. Someone was standing under the streetlight a few houses down, their form barely visible in the dim glow. Jacob's first instinct was fear, but something about the figure's posture gave him pause. They weren't moving closer. They were just standing there, watching. Before he could think it through, Jacob grabbed his father's locket and crept out of his room. He tiptoed past Nathan, who was still snoring on the couch, and opened the front door as quietly as possible. The night air was cool and damp, the street slick with rain. Jacob stepped outside, his small frame trembling as he stared at the figure in the distance. He couldn't see their face, but they didn't seem threatening. In fact, they seemed almost familiar. Who are you? Jacob called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they raised a hand and pointed directly at Jacob, just like before. But this time, they also raised their other hand, holding up an object that glinted faintly in the light. Jacob squinted, trying to make it out. It was small and rectangular, like a flash drive. What is that? Jacob asked. The figure still didn't speak. They placed the object on the ground and stepped back into the shadows, disappearing before Jacob could move. Jacob hesitated, his heart pounding. Every instinct told him to go back inside. But the curiosity burning in his chest was stronger. He ran down the street, his sneakers splashing through puddles, and stopped where the figure had been standing. The flash drive lay on the ground, its metallic surface slick with rain. Jacob picked it up, turning it over in his hand. There were no markings, no clues as to what it contained. But somehow, he knew it was important. In the present, Detective Hughes stared at the flash drive Jacob had handed her after his confession. "You're sure this is what they left for you?" she asked, holding it up. Jacob nodded. "They didn't say anything, but they made sure I saw it." Hughes glanced at Bryant, who stood nearby, his arms crossed. "Let's see what's on it," she said, handing the drive to a technician. Within minutes, the team had connected it to a secure computer and pulled up the contents. the screen filled with folders and files, each labeled with dates and cryptic codes. One file stood out, a video labeled for Jacob. Hughes's stomach twisted. "Play it," she said. The screen flickered to life, revealing a grainy video of a man sitting at a desk. Hughes recognized him immediately from the photo Jacob had shown her earlier. It was David Parker. Jacob gasped, his eyes wide. "That's my dad," he whispered. In the video, David looked older and more worn than in the photo. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but his voice was calm as he spoke. "Jacob," he said, "if you're watching this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. And now it's up to you." Hughes felt a chill run down her spine. The message was meant for an 11-year-old boy, but the weight of the words was overwhelming. "I know this is a lot to ask," David continued, "but you have to trust me. What I've left behind is dangerous, but it's also the key to everything. Keep it safe, Jacob, and no matter what happens, don't let them get their hands on it." The video cut off abruptly, leaving the room in stunned silence. Jacob stared at the screen, his hands clutching the locket around his neck. "What does he mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What did he leave behind?" Hughes knelt beside him, her expression serious. "We're going to figure that out," she said. "But Jacob, I need you to think. Did your dad ever talk about something he was working on? Something important?" Jacob shook his head. "No," he whispered. "He always said his work was boring." Hughes exchanged a glance with Bryant. "We need to dig into David Parker's records," she said. "If he left something behind, it could still be out there." Bryant nodded. "I'll get started." As he left, Hughes turned back to Jacob. "You're doing great," she said gently, "but I need you to stay close to us. We're going to keep you safe, okay?" Jacob nodded, but his eyes were filled with uncertainty. "What if they come for me?" he asked softly. Hughes placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They won't get to you," she said firmly. "Not while we're here." But even as she spoke the words, a deep sense of unease settled over her. Whoever was after Jacob wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And with David Parker's message hanging over them, one thing was clear: time was running out. The video of David Parker played over and over in Detective Hughes's mind as she sat in her office, reviewing the case. His words were deliberate and cryptic. "What I've left behind is dangerous. It's the key to everything." Whatever David had been working on, it was far from boring. It had painted a target on his son's back, and now Jacob was caught in the crossfire. Bryant entered, carrying a thick file. "Got everything we could find on David Parker," he said, dropping it onto the desk. "It's not much, but it's a start." Hughes opened the file, flipping through pages of employment records, tax filings, and personal documents. David had worked as a financial analyst for a mid-sized consulting firm, his role seemingly ordinary. But Hughes knew better than to take things at face value. "What about his death?" Hughes asked. "Anything unusual there?" Bryant hesitated. "Officially, it was a car accident. Single vehicle, no foul play suspected." But he paused, his expression grim. "I checked the crash report. Something doesn't add up." Hughes raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "The brakes on his car failed," Bryant explained. "The report says it was a mechanical issue, but there's no record of a prior complaint or any recall on the vehicle. It feels off." Hughes frowned, leaning back in her chair. "You think it wasn't an accident?" Bryant nodded. "It's possible. If he was involved in something dangerous, someone could have tampered with his car." Hughes exhaled sharply. The pieces were starting to form a troubling picture. David Parker's death, the hooded figure, Mrs. Carter's desperate actions. It all pointed to a hidden threat that had been brewing for years. 3 nights earlier, after Jacob found the flash drive, he crept back into his house, clutching it tightly in his hand. Nathan was still asleep on the couch, oblivious to the turmoil Jacob was facing. Jacob slipped into his room, locking the door behind him, and sat on his bed. He stared at the flash drive, his fingers trembling. What could be on it? Why had the figure gone to such lengths to give it to him? Summoning his courage, Jacob plugged the drive into his old laptop. The screen flickered as the drive loaded, revealing a single folder labeled Legacy. Jacob clicked it open, his heart pounding. Inside were dozens of files, documents, spreadsheets, and another video. He hesitated before clicking on the video. The screen filled with his father's face once again. "Jacob," his father said, his voice heavy with emotion. "If you're seeing this, it means things didn't go as planned. I hoped I would be there to explain everything, but now it's up to you." Jacob leaned closer, his breath catching. "I was part of a project," David continued. "A project that was supposed to help people. But it became something else, something dangerous. When I realized what was happening, I tried to stop it. That's why they came after me." Jacob's stomach twisted as he listened. "The information on this drive is everything you need to expose them," David said. "But it's also what they're after. You have to keep it safe, Jacob. And if anyone finds out you have it, you need to run." The video ended abruptly, leaving Jacob staring at the screen in stunned silence. His father's words repeated in his mind. "You need to run." In the present, Hughes leaned back in her chair, staring at the photo of David Parker on her desk. The man had clearly been entangled in something far more complex than his mundane job suggested. And whatever he had uncovered, it had cost him his life. Bryant returned, his expression tense. "We've got a problem," he said, handing Hughes a tablet. Hughes frowned as she looked at the screen. It displayed a series of surveillance images from outside the police station. In the most recent frame, a dark SUV was parked across the street, its occupants obscured by tinted windows. "They've been there for over an hour," Bryant said. "No movement, no plates. Just sitting there." Hughes's jaw tightened. "They're watching us." "Exactly," Bryant said. "And if they're here, it means they're not done with Jacob." Inside the station, Jacob sat in the interrogation room, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. He couldn't stop thinking about the flash drive, or his father's message. His dad had trusted him with something important, but Jacob didn't feel brave. He felt small, scared, and completely out of his depth. Detective Hughes entered, her face calm but determined. "Jacob," she said, sitting across from him, "I need to tell you something. There's a car outside. We think it might be connected to the people who've been after you." Jacob's eyes widened. "They're here?" Hughes nodded. "But you're safe. They can't get to you while you're in here. I just need you to stay calm and trust us." Jacob swallowed hard, clutching his locket for comfort. "What are they going to do?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Hughes said. "But I promise we won't let them hurt you." As she spoke, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, stepping out of the room. In the hallway, Bryant met her with a grim expression. "The SUV just left," he said. "But they didn't go far. One of our units followed them. They stopped at a warehouse on the edge of town." "A warehouse?" Hughes asked, her mind racing. "What's there?" "Not much," Bryant said. "It's an abandoned industrial site. But if they're using it as a base, it's worth checking out." Hughes nodded. "Get a team together. We're not letting this trail go cold." An hour later, Hughes and Bryant stood outside the warehouse, their weapons drawn. The building loomed in the darkness, its rusted metal walls covered in graffiti. The faint hum of voices drifted from inside, confirming that the place wasn't empty. Hughes signaled to the team, and they moved in silently, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The interior was cluttered with old machinery and scattered debris, but the voices grew louder as they advanced. As they rounded a corner, they saw them. A group of men huddled around a table covered in documents and maps. One of them was the tall figure Jacob had described, his posture commanding as he barked orders. Hughes motioned for the team to fan out, preparing to strike. But just as she moved closer, one of the men glanced up, and chaos erupted. "Police!" Hughes shouted, but the men scattered, some running deeper into the warehouse while others opened fire. The team returned fire, the deafening exchange echoing through the cavernous space. Hughes ducked behind a metal beam, her heart pounding. She caught a glimpse of the tall man fleeing toward an exit, a black bag slung over his shoulder. "Bryant!" she shouted. "He's heading for the back." Bryant nodded and took off after him, his footsteps pounding against the concrete floor. Hughes turned her attention back to the remaining suspects, her mind focused on one thing: finding out who these people were and what they were planning next. Detective Hughes advanced through the dimly lit warehouse, her focus razor-sharp. The gunfire had subsided, but the adrenaline still coursed through her veins. Around her, the team secured the remaining suspects, shouting commands as they subdued the men who hadn't escaped. Her radio crackled to life. "Hughes," came Bryant's voice, breathless but urgent. "He got away." Hughes cursed under her breath. The tall man, the leader, by all appearances, had slipped through their fingers. "Any idea where he went?" she asked, pressing the radio to her mouth. "Out the back," Bryant replied. "He had a car waiting." "I'm calling it in." Hughes exhaled slowly, frustration gnawing at her. Losing the leader was a blow, but they'd gained something valuable tonight: the warehouse. Whatever these people were planning, the clues left behind would give them answers. "Secure the scene," Hughes ordered. "We need every scrap of evidence cataloged." As the crime scene investigators swarmed the warehouse, Hughes sifted through the cluttered table where the men had gathered. Maps, notes, and photos were scattered across the surface. She picked up one of the photos, her stomach twisting when she saw it. It was a surveillance image of Jacob, taken outside his school. He was smiling, his backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unaware he was being watched. "They've been tracking him for weeks," Hughes murmured, showing the photo to Bryant, who had just returned from chasing the tall man. Bryant's jaw tightened. "They're not just after the information. They want the boy." Hughes nodded grimly, her eyes scanning the table for more clues. She found a crumpled piece of paper with hastily scrawled writing. "Access point. Project Legacy. Parker key. Secure before transfer." "What's Project Legacy?" Hughes muttered, her fingers tracing the words. Bryant shrugged. "Sounds like it's tied to David Parker's work. Whatever it is, it's big enough to kill 4. Hughes's gaze fell on a diagram next to the note. It was a blueprint of a building, an old government facility on the outskirts of town. A red circle marked one of the rooms. "This must be the access point," she said, holding up the blueprint. "They think the key to Project Legacy is there." Bryant frowned. "If they're right, we're running out of time." Back at the police station, Jacob sat alone in the interrogation room, his small hands wrapped around his father's locket. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything happening was somehow his fault. Mrs. Carter, the hooded figure, the strange men chasing him. None of it made sense, but he knew one thing. His dad had left him something important, and now people were willing to hurt him to get it. The door opened, and Detective Hughes walked in, her expression both reassuring and serious. She sat across from Jacob, placing the blueprint and photo on the table. "Jacob," she said gently, "I need to show you something." Jacob looked at the photo first, his face paling when he saw himself. "They were watching me?" he asked, his voice small. Hughes nodded. "Yes, but we're going to make sure they can't get to you." Jacob's eyes darted to the blueprint. "What's that?" "It's something connected to your dad," Hughes explained. "We think he was working on a project called Legacy, and this blueprint shows where the project might be hidden." Jacob frowned, studying the diagram. "Why would he hide something?" "Because it's dangerous," Hughes said, "but also important. Your dad wanted to protect it, and you—" Jacob swallowed hard, his fingers brushing the locket. "What do we do now?" Hughes leaned forward, her voice steady. "We're going to that location. If your dad left something behind, we need to find it before they do." The old government facility loomed in the darkness, its crumbling walls and overgrown grounds giving it an eerie, abandoned feel. Hughes, Bryant, and a small team approached cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the night. "This place hasn't been used in years," Bryant muttered, scanning the area. "If something's here, it's been hidden for a long time." Hughes nodded, her hand resting on the weapon at her side. "Stay alert. If they're looking for this place too, they might already be here." The team entered through a broken side door, the stale air inside thick with dust. The blueprint led them through a maze of hallways and empty rooms, each step echoing eerily in the silence. "Over here," Hughes called, stopping in front of a metal door with a keypad lock. The red circle on the blueprint marked this exact spot. Brian inspected the keypad. "Looks like it hasn't been touched in years." "You think your kid can crack it?" he asked, half joking. Hughes didn't laugh. "We'll figure it out," she said, motioning for the team's tech specialist. As the specialist worked on the lock, Jacob's voice echoed in Hughes's mind. My dad said the locket would protect me. She glanced at the small chain hanging around her neck, the locket Jacob had handed her for safekeeping. Wait, Hughes said, stopping the specialist. Let me try something. She removed the locket and pressed the flat side against the keypad. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a faint beep, the lock disengaged. Bryant raised an eyebrow. Well, I'll be damned. Hughes pushed the door open, revealing a small, secure room. Inside was a single metal box, no larger than a briefcase. Its surface was covered in a layer of dust, but the words etched into the top were unmistakable. Project Legacy. Hughes carefully lifted the box, her heart pounding. We've got it, she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. Let's get it out of here. But as the team turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Hughes froze, her grip tightening on the box. They're here, she whispered. The team quickly took defensive positions, their weapons drawn. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until the tall man from the warehouse appeared, flanked by two others. His cold gaze locked onto the box in Hughes's hands. You've made this harder than it needed to be, the man said, his voice low and menacing. Hand it over. Hughes didn't flinch. Not a chance. The man smirked, reaching into his jacket. I was hoping you'd say that. Before anyone could react, the hallway erupted in chaos. The air filled with the deafening sound of gunfire, flashes of light bursting through the dim corridor. Detective Hughes dove behind a rusted metal cabinet, clutching the metal box marked Project Legacy tightly to her chest. Shouts and footsteps echoed as her team returned fire, their voices sharp with commands. Stay low, Bryant barked, firing a round that ricocheted off the walls near the tall man. They've got us pinned. Hughes gritted her teeth, her mind racing. She peeked around the corner, catching a glimpse of the tall man orchestrating the attack with calm precision. He was a professional, calculated, ruthless, and determined. Hughes, Bryant called out, ducking beside her. What's the plan? She glanced at the box in her hands, knowing it was the prize these men had come for. They weren't leaving without it, but neither was she. We can't let them take this, she said firmly. We need to find another way out. Bryant nodded, his jaw tight. I'll cover you. Get that thing to safety. Watch yourself, Hughes said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She reached for her radio, her voice low but urgent. Team Alpha, status? Hallway clear on the west side, came the reply. But we're hearing movement. More might be coming. Hughes swore under her breath. Reinforcements weren't just likely, they were inevitable. Hold your position. We're moving to you. Bryant gave her a quick nod before stepping out of cover, firing a series of suppressing shots to force the attackers back. Go, he shouted. Hughes darted down the hallway, the box tucked tightly under her arm. Her heart pounded in her chest as she navigated the labyrinth of corridors, the faint sound of footsteps and gunfire echoing behind her. Jacob sat in the back seat of a police car parked a safe distance from the facility, his knees pulled to his chest. He stared at the dark building, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Why are they taking so long? He asked the officer guarding him, his voice small. They'll be out soon, the officer replied, his tone calm but unconvincing. Jacob gripped his father's locket, the weight of it grounding him. His dad had trusted him with something important, but Jacob didn't feel brave or strong. He felt helpless, like a kid caught in something far bigger than himself. Suddenly, the faint sound of a vehicle engine reached his ears. Jacob turned, his stomach dropping as a black SUV emerged from the shadows, speeding toward the facility. They're here, Jacob whispered. The officer stiffened, his hand moving to his weapon. Stay in the car, he ordered, stepping out and radioing for backup. Jacob watched as the SUV screeched to a halt near the facility's entrance. Men in dark clothing spilled out, their movements quick and coordinated. Jacob's chest tightened as he realized these were the same people who had been following him. They're going after Detective Hughes, he murmured to himself. Without thinking, he opened the car door. Kid, get back here, the officer shouted, But Jacob was already running, his small frame darting into the darkness. Inside the facility, Hughes and Bryant regrouped with the rest of the team in a narrow corridor. "We need to get out of here," Hughes said, her voice firm. "They're bringing backup." The team nodded, forming a protective circle around Hughes as they moved toward the west exit. The box felt heavier with every step, its contents an enigma that people were willing to kill for. As they neared the exit, a burst of gunfire rang out, forcing them to take cover. The tall man emerged from the shadows, his cold eyes locking onto Hughes. "You're wasting your time, detective," he said, his voice steady. "That box doesn't belong to you." "It doesn't belong to you either," Hughes shot back, raising her weapon. "Stand down." The man smirked. "You don't understand what you're holding. Hand it over, and I might let you walk out of here." Hughes tightened her grip on the box. "Not happening." The man sighed, shaking his head. "Have it your way." He signaled to his men, and the firefight erupted again. Hughes crouched behind cover, her mind racing for a way out. The west exit was just ahead, but they were pinned down, and time was running out. Outside, Jacob crept closer to the facility, his small figure hidden in the shadows. He didn't know what he was going to do, only that he couldn't sit back and do nothing. He gripped his father's locket, its smooth surface warm against his palm, and whispered, "Dad, help me be brave." As he neared the entrance, he spotted the SUV parked nearby. The doors were open, and the engine was still running. An idea sparked in his mind, a reckless, terrifying idea. Jacob climbed into the driver's seat, his small hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. He glanced at the dashboard, his heart pounding. He'd watched Nathan drive before, but he'd never done it himself. Still, he had to try. "I can do this," he whispered to himself. He pressed the gas pedal, and the SUV lurched forward, the sudden movement drawing the attention of the men guarding the entrance. They shouted in surprise, but Jacob didn't stop. He steered the vehicle toward the facility, his determination outweighing his fear. Inside, the sound of screeching tires echoed through the building, momentarily distracting the attackers. Hughes seized the opportunity, signaling her team to move. "Go," she shouted, leading the charge toward the west exit. As they emerged into the open air, they saw the SUV barreling toward the group of attackers. The men scrambled to get out of the way, their formation breaking apart. "What the hell?" Bryant muttered, raising his weapon. Hughes's eyes widened as she recognized the driver. "Jacob!" she shouted. The SUV skidded to a stop, and Jacob jumped out, his face pale but determined. "I couldn't let them hurt you," he said, his voice trembling. Hughes crouched beside him, gripping his shoulders. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her tone a mix of relief and frustration. "I had to help," Jacob insisted, tears welling in his eyes. Before Hughes could respond, the tall man emerged from the shadows, his gun raised. "Enough games," he growled. "Give me the box, or the boy gets hurt." The tension was palpable, the standoff precarious. Hughes stepped in front of Jacob, shielding him with her body. "You're not laying a finger on him," she said, her voice cold. The man smirked, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Then you've made your choice." The world seemed to freeze, the tall man's words lingering like a death sentence. Detective Hughes tightened her grip on Jacob's shoulders, her body a shield between him and the danger before them. Around them, the echoes of the firefight subsided as both sides turned their attention to the standoff. "Drop your weapon," Hughes ordered, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "You won't get what you're after." The tall man tilted his head, his smirk unflinching. "You still think you can protect him? You have no idea what's in that box, detective. It's bigger than you. Bigger than him." He gestured at Jacob, whose trembling hands clutched the locket around his neck. "You don't know what my dad left me," Jacob said suddenly, his voice small but defiant. His words surprised even Hughes. "But he trusted me with it, not you." The man's smirk faltered for a split second, and Hughes seized the opening. "Now!" she shouted, and her team sprang into action. Shots rang out as the police opened fire, forcing the man and his team to scatter. Hughes grabbed Jacob, pulling him behind a stack of crates for cover. "Stay down," she ordered. Her heart pounding, Bryant darted to the other side of the lot, his rifle trained on the fleeing attackers. "They're retreating," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. But the tall man wasn't retreating. He moved with precision, his weapon firing calculated shots that forced the officers back. Hughes realized he wasn't just trying to escape, he was still focused on the box. "Bryant, cover me," Hughes yelled, clutching the box tightly as she made a break for the police SUV Jacob had driven. She needed to secure the contents before the man could get to it. Jacob watched in horror as the tall man turned his attention to Hughes, his weapon aimed directly at her back. "No!" he screamed, jumping to his feet. The man hesitated at the sound of Jacob's voice, his eyes narrowing. "You want to play the hero, boy?" he sneered, stepping toward him. "Let's see how brave you really are." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. He gripped the locket tightly, his father's voice echoing in his mind. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right. Hughes reached the SUV, throwing open the door and shoving the box inside. She turned just in time to see Jacob standing in the open, facing the tall man. Her blood ran cold. "Jacob," she screamed, "get down." But Jacob didn't move. He held the locket high, his voice shaking but strong. "You're not getting it," he shouted. "You can't have what my dad left." The tall man froze, his expression flickering between anger and curiosity. "That locket," he muttered, lowering his weapon slightly. "What's inside it?" Hughes realized the truth in that instant. The locket wasn't just sentimental, it was the key. David Parker hadn't just left a metaphorical legacy. He'd hidden something physical, something vital, inside the locket. "Run, Jacob," Hughes shouted, stepping forward with her gun raised. "Now!" The tall man reacted, his weapon swinging back toward Hughes, but he was too slow. Bryant appeared behind him, tackling him to the ground in a flurry of movement. The gun clattered from the man's hand as the two struggled. "Get him out of here," Bryant yelled, pinning the tall man down. Hughes grabbed Jacob, pulling him toward the SUV. "We're leaving," she shouted, throwing the vehicle into gear as soon as they climbed inside. The police SUV roared down the road, leaving the chaos of the facility behind. Jacob sat in the passenger seat, his small frame trembling with adrenaline. Hughes glanced at him, her heart still racing. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Jacob looked down at the locket in his hand. "I didn't want them to hurt you," he whispered. Hughes softened, her hand briefly resting on his shoulder. "You were brave, Jacob, but next time, let me handle the danger, okay?" He nodded, though his eyes remained on the locket. "Do you think my dad hid something in here?" he asked. "I think he hid the most important piece of the puzzle," Hughes said. "And now it's up to us to figure out what it is." Back at the station, Hughes and Bryant sat with Jacob in a secure room. The locket lay on the table, its smooth surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Are you ready?" Hughes asked gently. Jacob nodded, his fingers fumbling with the clasp. It popped open with a soft click, revealing the tiny photo of him and his dad. But beneath the photo was something else, a small, hidden compartment. Jacob's breath hitched as Hughes carefully removed the contents, a microchip no larger than a fingernail. "What is that?" Jacob asked, his voice filled with wonder and fear. "It's the key to everything," Hughes said, her voice low. "Your dad's work, Project Legacy. It's all in here." Bryant studied the microchip, his brow furrowed. "We need to analyze this. If the people chasing us knew about this, it's bigger than we thought." Hughes nodded, placing the microchip in a secure evidence bag. "Jacob," she said, turning to him, "you did exactly what your dad would have wanted. You kept his legacy safe." Jacob's eyes welled with tears, but he nodded. "What happens now?" "Now," Hughes said, "we finish what your dad started." As the team prepared to uncover the secrets of the microchip, Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The people after Jacob wouldn't stop, not until they had what they wanted. But one thing was certain. As long as she was around, they would never get to him. The legacy David Parker had left wasn't just a project, it was hope. And Hughes was determined to protect it, no matter the cost.